Thank you very much. It's hard to believe that I'm actually standing in front of people now talking about rebreathers, because in 1996 I was quoted in the book Shadow Divers at an interview in the back saying that I'm not going to dive a rebreather until it says Craftsman on the side of it. And the reason for that was that my dive partner at the time, John Chatterton, considers himself a bit of a test pilot. And he was using various experimental and homemade rebreathers, not to a very good effect, I must add. And so I, at that time, recognized that, at least for me, technology hadn't arrived. It wouldn't be until, while working on a television program, Deep Sea Detectives, that I would be a member of a four-man team, John Chatterton, Evan Kovacs, and a gentleman named DJ Roller. And I was the only open-circuit cog in the machine. The other three were all diving inspirations. And over a period of roughly 3 years, we dove in a variety of locations, climates, and conditions, some quite remote. And during that time, there was absolutely no failures of the rebreathers. And over that time, the advantage of diving a closed-circuit rebreather became evident to me, especially when on some of the deeper, longer dives, I would still be decompressing. They'd be on the boat eating my lunch. So that was a motivation for me to now re-examine closed-circuit rebreathers. And with the advent of the evolution, I jumped on board with my wife with both feet. I not only became a big fan of rebreather for the type of diving that I do, which is more technical, but I became a bit of a zealot. I felt compelled to spread the word and become an instructor. And I started teaching and still teach both air diluent all the way up to trimix. I love my rebreather. I love actually the technology. I love the ability it gives me. But as you're going to see in my presentation, this ability comes with a cost. If you want to ride a bicycle to work, you can get there. It's going to take you a longer time. But if you want to get there quicker, you ride a motorcycle. But with that comes added responsibility of you as an operator. As an instructor, I often use a parallel with my students between flying and being a pilot and flying or diving your rebreather. And at first glance, it could seem obvious, or maybe you don't see it. But the reality is that we are both dependent on machinery to keep us alive. And much like a pilot, generally it's you at the stick. It's totally within your hands how it's going to be. When you look at the FAA accident reports for small pilots, 75% are pilot error. And that includes flying into inclement weather, because that was a decision that a pilot made. So basically, good pilots are flying good aircraft into the ground. And I am finding in the last few years that there is a similarity occurring in the closed circuit world, where good divers are flying good rebreathers into the ground. You know, as I mentioned, your life support is dependent on the rebreather not only being properly maintained. That would be dependent on any other gear. But when we look at the aircraft, all aircraft have to be certified federally. They can't fly unless they've been inspected. They have regular maintenance done. Then, not only that, they have to be prepared properly before they're going to take off down the runway. All of this is being done with a federal oversight. But the bottom line is, the guy who steps into that aircraft, or the diver who straps on that rebreather, ultimately is the end all. He is the one that has to pre-flight that unit. And the way that they do it is with a specific checklist. Each individual aircraft, have a unique checklist that you have to follow item by item in a very specific order so that you could safely take off. And it's the same thing with a rebreather. The difference with a rebreather, though, is there's an added function. A checklist, a manufacturer-supplied checklist, is going to allow you to properly assemble that unit. And now, obviously, a pilot doesn't have to assemble his plane, but he does have to get it ready. There are many different components. And, we are human beings, and we will err. We will make mistakes. We will have memory lapses. And I drive this point home not only to the people that are interested or looking at rebreathers, but more importantly to my peers, to the more experienced rebreather divers, who after 100, 200, 1,000 hours on rebreathers, complacency settles in because the technology does work. The equipment does work. And as I mentioned earlier, the most fallible part of it is the human component. So when we are assembling our specific units, we need to meticulously follow a checklist. It doesn't matter whether you've done it 1,000 times. It only takes one phone call. It only takes one interruption for you to miss a spot. And unfortunately, good divers are no longer with us because that's exactly what has happened. They have missed a component. They have missed an O-ring. Or they just didn't do it at all because it worked on the previous dive. As I mentioned, the private pilots have a support team. They not only have aircraft that have to be maintained and checked out, otherwise it will not be allowed to leave the tarmac. But they also have air traffic controllers, people looking out for them, saying, hey, don't fly here, you can fly there, these conditions exist. They have ground crew that will work on their aircraft for them. But ultimately, once they're ready to kick the tires and light the fires, they have to do the walk around. They personally accept the responsibility of going around that aircraft and checking every aspect of it. A few months ago in the news, I don't know if any of you had picked up on this, there was a major jetliner, I don't recall what airline, that a pilot was doing his walk around, and he actually found a bullet hole in the fuselage. And as incredulous as it is that someone shot at an airliner, I found it even more amazing that a man could look up and 30 feet in the air have that level of detail that he could actually find and see that hole. Needless to say, they grounded the aircraft and there was no fly, no dive. I think we need to be as diligent in checking out our rebreathers before we ever get in the water. Because we don't have a ground crew. We don't have anyone besides us. I mean, annually you should have your equipment maintained as per whatever the manufacturer's specifications are. But whether you're in your garage, you're on the back deck of a boat, or you are assembling on a picnic table in a quarry, you are everything. You are the ground control, you are a pilot, and you are taking your life quite literally into your own hands. From the initial assembly, as I mentioned, the checklist is going to be important because, as you can see in this photograph, there's lots of little parts. They may not be moving parts, but there's lots of little parts that must be assembled in a very specific fashion. And there's going to be lots of other things that I'll get into, like pre-dive checks, like making sure that before you even put that unit on, that everything is correctly assembled, and that before you even jump in the water, you've actually pre-dived the unit while sitting on the boat to make sure that everything is up and running. So until you splash, that checklist is going to be your primary defense against something going wrong and being prepared for it. One of the things that I would always teach my students is that even if you follow the checklist, I can't guarantee that a unit can't fail. Of course, it's a machine. It could break. Something can go wrong. But by following your checklist, you've done everything within your power to make sure that doesn't happen. And equally as important, you've prepared for that contingency by making sure that your options for bailout or self-rescue are also operational and working. So as CCR divers, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to follow this checklist. Getting back to that parallel between diving a rebreather and flying an aircraft, I really think that CCRs have a lot more in common with rotary or helicopters. And the reason is, do we have any pilots? Is there anybody who flies in this room? A couple? How many of you have flown a helicopter? You've taken the stick. Night and day. Night and day. Absolutely different. You look up in the sky, oh yeah, they fly. And like diving, you look in the water, you see open circuit and closed circuit. It looks similar, but that's only in appearances. The difference on rotary aircraft is that, both of your hands, you've got a cyclic in one hand, you've got a collective in the other, you've got both feet on the pedals, you're pushing a little button to communicate with other aircraft, and all the time you're trying to fly in a three-dimensional way. And anybody who's ever tried to hover with a helicopter understands the complexity of what's going on. Rebreathers add that level of complexity to diving. Although they don't have as many moving parts, there are as many different layers of obligation of you as the operator to monitor. Whereas you fill a scuba tank up with gas, you analyze it, that's not going to change. A very smart person once said in front of me that the most dangerous thing you'll ever do is manipulate your own breathing medium. And that, in effect, is what you're doing on a rebreather. And it's your obligation to make sure that you're constantly on the stick. Because diving a CCR, there's a lot going on. And quite simple, I don't care what automation you have, there is no autopilot. You need to constantly be monitoring it. Because if you let it get away from you, it will kill you. Now, regardless of what manufacturer or what type of rebreather you have, all of them are always going to do some of the following, again, in a very specific order. They're always going to want you to confirm, i.e. analyze and correctly label into an appropriate bottle so that there is no mistake between oxygen and your diluent. Make sure it is exactly what you want it to be. They're going to make you confirm that your scrubbing material is adequate and good for the dive that you have planned, that you're not reusing old scrubber. Once you've assembled all of the components, as I showed you in that earlier photograph, now you're going to have to assemble your unit. And I personally like to assemble my unit the day before a dive. I never like to do it the day of the dive. It doesn't give you many options in case you have a problem. And the human animal being what he is, we have a tendency under pressure to look past a nicked O-ring, to say that's only a small leak. You give yourself plenty of time during the assembly and follow your checklist and check everything, whether it's a positive and negative pressure, except zero failure. There is no reason, there's nothing down there that is so important that you need to risk your life because a small component wasn't 100%. I don't know about the rest of you, but I value my life enough that I'm not about to do that. Obviously, as you're powering up the unit after it's assembled, you have another obligation as the pilot to now confirm that the cells are working, that the electronics are within parameters, that everything is exactly ready to go diving. Only then, once you've completed all of that aspects of the checklist, are you now ready to do the pre-dive sequence, where on the boat or on the picnic table, if you're in a quarry, you now basically dive the unit on the surface. You're going to sit there and do a pre-breathe. You're going to make sure, if your unit is so equipped, that your scrubber material is reacting. You're going to make sure that your cells are reacting. You're going to make sure that all of the gases are flowing and that you're not depleting, there isn't a valve going. You're going to do that for about at least 5 minutes and make sure that you feel good, it's operating good. As you stand up and you then put your checklist down and you stand up to the edge of the boat or walk to the edge of the water, the final thing that is a major component of the checklist, and there are many rebreathers now that actually have within the handsets electric prompts, basically screens that you need to click through. These prompts are secondary to your written checklist. They don't tell you how to assemble the unit. They don't tell you how to analyze your gas. They may ask you if you've done it. But the reality is your primary defense is always going to be the manufacturer's supplied checklist. The secondary thing as you stand up is to do, and again, depending on your training agency, I like to use the term ABCs as you're standing up and about to enter the water, where you're checking, again, physically that all gases are on. You're going to check that all electronics are on. You're going to actually push all your buttons and make sure that as you're looking at them, you're looking at a gauge to see that the gas doesn't go down. You're going to check your computers, looking at it before you put that loop in your mouth and make sure that you've got a good gas to breathe. You're going to make sure that all of your set points and all of your decompression information is correct in the computer. And only then are you ready to dive. Another thing that I can't give credit to it, I don't know where I picked it up from, but I believe in it fully, is that we should never put a rebreather on our back unless it is fully on and pre-flighted and operational, and we should never we should never turn it off until we've taken it off our body and it's on the bench. The reason for this may not seem obvious, but believe it or not, there have been people, and I've seen it myself, jump in the water with a rebreather that had been operational earlier, but then they shut it off, and then they turn it back on, and then they forget to turn it back on and jump in the water. Lots of things happen. Sometimes it's, hey, I just dropped my watch. It could be the silliest thing, but the simple thing of not ever putting the unit on unless it's on and not turning it off until it's off of you can make the difference. As I mentioned, each checklist is always going to be specific to the unit, but many of us, like I don't know if anybody rides a Harley, we like to customize our ride, and I think rebreather divers are no different. There's aftermarket parts, there's all kinds of things that people love to add to their rebreathers. Anytime you alter the rebreather from what you were trained on, from what the manufacturer sold you, for what the checklist is for, you now have to add that item to the checklist. You have to train or be trained. I won't mention a friend in this audience, but I watched him have extreme difficulty because under duress he was asked by a film crew to use a full face mask that he had never been trained for. And, the people were like, oh, it's simple, it won't be a problem. Until, of course, it didn't fit, and in like 12 feet of water, he's drowning. It may seem humorous, but there are people that will strap on a new piece of kit, put it on their equipment, and then just go and make a big dive, not take the time to either A, if appropriate, be trained in the use of it, and then B, more importantly, not incorporate that new piece of equipment into their checklist, which is now, again, a vital component of their life support system. I'm sure for those of you that are experienced, you've heard it over and over again. If you make an error in any of the phases of doing a rebreather dive, whether it is the assembly, whether it's not to properly pre-flight it, to make the assumption that you did it correctly, or to fail to monitor your PPO2 throughout the dive. It's not a maybe. You will die. It's just a matter simply when. It's no different than a pilot reading a book and not watching as he flies into an antenna. You have to be on the ball. You have to be willing to commit this level of attention or responsibility if you want the added benefit of diving a rebreather. As I mentioned earlier, in my mind, it is the human element. It is the man behind or the woman behind the machine that is the most fallible thing. We prepare, we train for equipment failure. We carry bailout. I'm pretty sure pilots wish that they could, if they had a major failure, jump into another airplane. They can't. They have to make the best they can if their aircraft is damaged. We, on the other hand, have an option. If our rebreather is non-functioning or we're not happy with it, we can bail out. But our checklist is going to be our primary defense to not get there. Unfortunately, we are human, and over the next 3 days, many people smarter than I are going to talk to you about accidents that have occurred while diving rebreathers. They're going to use statistics. They're going to use technical terms. They're going to show you ratios. It's analytical and detached. I know that everybody understands what we're talking about. But in the last few years, I've had a couple of really close friends. I've had mentors, people that have actually taken me to some of the deepest dives I've ever done. Instructors, students, all friends. All of them planned to go and have a good time that day. But in the end, they didn't come home. I like to keep their faces with me. They're not fools. They weren't stupid, but they made foolish mistakes. Each one of them died while diving on a rebreather. Some of them died very shallow, some of them died very deep. But the point is, they all had one, if not a combination, of these events occur. And each one of them, as I read down them, will almost definitely be attributable back to a failure failure during their checklist. Failure to turn on oxygen. Some of them have made a dive earlier in the day, took the unit off, jumped back in the water. When they were found, the oxygen was off. Failure to properly analyze and label gases. This is, again, a basic entry-level checklist item that should have been done, and yet it wasn't done. Failure to change scrubber. I can't even begin to rationalize this. The cost of softener lime being what it is why would you not change it? And yet, this is another factor that played in. Failure to monitor PTVO2. This is obviously one that will circle back to oxygen off. They weren't simply watching what was going on, and they flew a very good working aircraft directly into the ground. Failure to be certified and qualified. Although this isn't truly a checklist item, I have to mention it because this happens sometimes to some of the more experienced yet complacent rebreather divers where they figure, hey, I'm pretty smart, I can handle this, I know what to do. Unfortunately, they didn't. And sometimes it's entry-level people that choose to go a little further than they're ready, whether it's diving too deep, diving too long, using gases for which they're not trained, and ultimately paying for it with their lives. Failure to have proper bailout. There's two different schools of thought on how your bailout should be prepared, whether you should have the valve on or closed off, as in technical diving, open circuit, where you would keep your gases charged but off. I've always taught my students, and I believe with my whole heart, that you have to carry bailout and think of yourself as an old gunslinger in the Wild West. Your hand is poised above it, you know exactly where it is, and you can get it in a second. When you're falling out of a plane and your primary chute doesn't open, you don't want to go through your lunchbox and find all different stuff to try and get your backup parachute. It should be instantly accessible, whether you use a BOV or you're going to use off-board gas. Failure to have proper and working bailout. And I find this one also incredible that people can carry bailout and then when it was needed, there would be no regulator on the tank. And I just cannot wrap my hands around this because, again, if we go back to the checklist, this is unacceptable. You should have never gotten off the boat. Going back to their picture, if there's one thing that I can impart to you all, is that some of them were very smart. They're smarter than me, but they made mistakes. We all should not fail to learn from their mistakes. We need to move forward. And although I have quite a few hours on a rebreather, I approach it with reverence and I'm humble to it. I'm humble to the technology, and I realize that for what I want to do, this is the best tool for me to use, but it comes with a price. I don't want to pay the price that they paid. I'm willing to pay the time to make sure that my unit is correctly assembled and prepared. Because failure is not